Hello, and welcome to 1981. This is Friday the 13th, part 2, because it makes sense to jump straight into a long-running franchise with the first sequel, as opposed to the first film. The reason being is I have a lot to say about the original Friday the 13th film, so I thought I'd put it off for now, and just talk about the sequel. I may have a couple of guests on to talk about the original film, so it should be a bumper episode, so to speak. This film, it was rushed into production immediately after the success of the original Friday the 13th. So we're talking 1980 was the time this came into conception. The production, the pre-production, the filming, post-production, it was all done within a year of the first film, which is quite impressive. And it did bring back a lot of the same crew members. You know, there's a couple of faces pop up in the cast. We'll go into that shortly. There's a couple of minor characters, as well as obviously a returning protagonist. This is, I think it's one of the most sort of well-seen films, to put it that way, of the series. It was certainly one of the most popular sequels. It was really riding the big slasher boom of the early 80s. And for me, what really sticks in my mind about this one is it's the only sequel which really gets the feeling and the atmosphere right. And by right, I mean, you know, echoing what was done with the first film. And I think the most obvious reason for that is if you look at the filming location of this one compared to the first film, and then everything that came afterwards with the other sequels. The original film, as I'm sure most people know, it was filmed in New Jersey at Camp Nobi Bosco, which is obviously a Boy Scout camp in the wilds of New Jersey. So this one, it's not New Jersey. This one's actually Connecticut. It's Camp Kenwood in again, the wilds of Connecticut. But, you know, those who know their North American geography know that Connecticut as a state is only one state over from New Jersey, so you've got New York in the middle. So in terms of the topography and the environment, this summer camp and the town actually, which features in the early part of the film, it really looks like it could be the same location as the first Friday the 13th, which I think really helps this film. It really helps it feel like a continuation of the same world and the same, like, you know, characters and story as the first one, which is great. You probably know that after this film they shifted the shooting to California, which is obviously thousands of miles away from where these two were filmed. And it does show. I mean, I love a lot of the sequels after this, but they don't quite feel the same. And obviously it's because you go from the northeast of North America down to the southwest, you know, the Pacific coast, and it's just not the same. But anyway, that works in favour of this film. It really does feel like the first one, which is great. So it opens up with, it's a really, really protracted recap of the first film, and you kind of see why they did it for the time. You know, people saw these films in the cinema, and, you know, drive-ins, things like that. So even though it had only been, a year at most, since most of these people had seen the original, it still, you know, it recaps the ending of the first film. It really emphasises the mention of Jason in the first film, for obvious reasons. Betsy Palmer, Mrs. Voorhees, is the original killer. She was done away with in the first film, even though she does actually turn up in this one, briefly. And then obviously the focus is now shifting to Jason as the main antagonist, which it's debatable whether, I mean, obviously now in hindsight it was a good idea because they got a 12, 13 film franchise from this and counting. But at the time it's like, was that really the best idea? It doesn't make sense, you know, narratively speaking. How is this kid alive? It was well established in the first film that, you know, he drowned in the lake as a boy. That's the whole catalyst for why Mrs. Voorhees is killing people in the first film. And then all of a sudden, the second film, they rewrite history, which is, a major bugbear of mine in films and stories, to say that actually he didn't drown. People thought he did, and then he was just living in the woods for God knows how many years. Doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense at all. Did Mrs. Voorhees not know he was alive? Presumably not, otherwise why did she go on a killing spree? if that's the case, he knew she was alive because he saw, not alive, sorry, he knew she was seeking vengeance for his death because he watched her get killed. He was there. Why didn't he intervene? Why didn't he let himself known to his mother before this? It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't really... Well, I say it doesn't matter. It does, because it does hurt the narrative a lot. But you've got to look past it, to be honest. So, ignoring all those narrative flaws, this is the sequel. Jason's alive. The opening shots, the opening scene, so he tracks down Adrian King's character, who was the lone survivor of the first film, who killed his mother. Jason tracks her down and, offs her in the first few minutes. What's weird about this scene, not so much weird in terms of this film, but the opening where the rain has just stopped, we see the feet of Jason enter the frame. Just before this, there's I think it's a young girl singing Itsy Bitsy Spider. It's very, very, very similar to the opening of the TV adaptation of Stephen King's It from 1990. So I'm sure that film must have been taking influence from this scene, because the parallels are just too obvious, I think. But it's an interesting thing to note. It just shows, even though these slasher films and sequels from the early 80s were largely seen as trash, they did have a ripple effect, and they did kind of pop up in a certain manner in different sort of genres and different films, even by more reputable filmmakers as well. So it's interesting. So what I've got a problem with in this first scene, it must be set literally months after the events of the first film, because Adrian King says as much on the phone to her mother, that it's the best way she could deal with the trauma, the post-traumatic stress from those events, is to live in isolation and kind of draw and paint in that house she's living in, presumably renting out. And it's presumably near Camp Crystal Lake because Jason walks there. There's no insinuation that Jason can drive in any of these films, not like Michael Myers. So presumably he did walk to Alice's house. So if it's only a few months after the events of the first film, why is Jason a grown man? Like, I'm not sure when did he drown, supposedly? Was it 1959, 1958? Actually, I guess he would be fully grown by then. But yeah, I guess it's not really worth trying to make sense of all these ties and all these different plot points. But whatever, it's fine. Fine, he's a grown adult. He kills Adrian King after presumably calling her on the phone. That's another strange thing about this film. Obviously, her mother calls. They have an argument on the phone. She hangs up. The phone rings again after she's been in the shower. And then the caller hangs up. So, you're left to think, who is this? Obviously it adds kind of atmosphere and tension, because you think, oh, there's a creepy caller, But in any other kind of slasher film, it would be obvious that that's the killer kind of messing with the victim, the kind of foreplay until he kills his desired victim. But in this case, we're talking about Jason, who, he can't even talk. So how can he use a phone? How did he know what her telephone number was? But I digress. These are just interesting nitpicks that anyone who's seen the film sort of 25 times might pick up on. Otherwise, you probably don't care. But it's a nice little tense sort of first scene. She finds Mrs. Voorhees' head in the fridge, which is also a little bit strange, but never mind. That leads up to her getting, I think, a knitting needle through the temple, which is a nice way to go. Just on that note, all of the death scenes, the gore scenes in this film, I think they were very much trimmed by the NPAA. But in a weird way, it's not really a detriment to the film, I don't think. This is a very short runtime for a slasher film. I mean, slasher films don't normally go on that long, but this is only, 79 minutes, maybe 80 minutes? And it goes over really quickly, which is definitely a good thing. It works in the film's favour. Despite all this, talking about the intro, though, it's very protracted. It's a very protracted film, but the intro isn't, and that it's strange because, as I said, it recaps so much of the first film that it takes you a while to actually get into the full plot of this film and then meet the new characters. But when you do, it's great. The pace is great, and as I say, the setting is perfect, absolutely perfect. So, talking about the new characters, we've got the new final girl, who I think is a fan favourite, as far as I can tell, and rightly so, because she's not Adrian King version 2 at all. Really not. So this is Ginny. She's very much like, she's self-sufficient, she's independent, she's what she's studying. She's a graduate studying child psychology, which is mentioned a couple of times in the film, and actually comes into play in the climax where she kind of talks to Jason and manipulates his vulnerabilities, so to speak. So obviously he's psychologically, he's got issues, he's got mommy issues, so to speak, and he hasn't had any sort of social interaction with the normal world, on top of the fact that he almost drowned, lived in the woods for most of his life. So she uses that to her advantage and obviously gets away in the end, which is awesome, because that's actually set up from her very first scene when she mentions this to her rather dull boyfriend, Paul, who doesn't match her on-screen presence at all. But it's fine. Amy Steele, that's the actress's name. It had escaped me, but I've just remembered. So Amy Steele playing Ginny. So apologies, I don't actually make any notes when I do these retrospectives. I'm just kind of winging it. So I may forget some actress or actors' names every now and then, but, it's no big deal. I think the people who listen to this largely know all this anyway, so it's fine. So yeah, this is Steve Miner's directorial debut. So this guy, he worked, I think he was an associate producer on the original film, and then he's given the reins to direct this one, and he does a good job. He goes on to make direct part 3 as well, which I also love. But it is actually quite a well-made film. There's some quite artistic shots, or well thought out shots, so to speak. The one that springs to mind is when I forget the character's name, but the girl who goes and spruces herself up for Mark, the guy in the wheelchair. She goes across to her cabin. We see her go into the cabin. We see her, applying perfume, all that kind of thing, changing her underpants, which is, whatever. Personal hygiene is obviously top of her priority list, which is good. But then she leaves the cabin and goes to the car to get something out of the car. But all the while, the camera stays inside the cabin. So we see her, she leaves, and then it focuses through the window, and out the window we can see perfectly framed is her car. And then we can actually see her from this vantage point going into the car, which, it's little things like that, which it just makes the film more interesting to look at than it could be. It could be filmed a lot more pedestrian, flat angles, just shots showing, this is what happens here, it's change shot to here, reverse angles, all that stuff. If you watch this film closely, it doesn't really do that. It's not Hitchcock, it's not Kubrick by any means, but for an early 80s slasher film, I think it is quite well done. The cinematography is quite well done, which I do appreciate. So the lake's it's a great setting again. You can imagine this is the same lake from the first film. Again, it's because I said it's roughly the same geographical area. That being said, the two characters who, to my mind, it's basically kind of Kevin Bacon and his girlfriend from the first film. Someone Taylor, I believe, I think. I can't remember her first name, but never mind. They are basically kind of... There's a surrogate couple in this film. The character names it's Jeff and Sandra. You'll know the two I mean. They're the first two who we meet when their car gets towed away as a joke early on by the obligatory Joker character, who again he's interesting. I'll get on to him in a second. So these two, the Kevin Bacon and the girlfriend's surrogates in this film, they go off to find Camp Blood, obviously, which they're not supposed to do. And if you watch this carefully, they discuss this by the lake shore, and then they leave to the right of frame, which is fine. It cuts to a shot of them walking along the lake shore with the lake on their right-hand side, which again is fine. Not a problem. But then it cuts to a next shot where they're walking along the lakeside, but it's reversed, and now the lake shore is on their left, which doesn't make any sense. Again, this might not bother most people. It did bother me, because it's like I like to try and picture in this fictional world where these camps are in relation to each other. So they're walking sort of, I don't know, let's say east along the lake, But then it cuts to another shot, and they're suddenly walking west along the lake, and yeah, it doesn't really sit right with me. But there's, a geeky sort of observation for you. I've clearly seen this film too many times. So yeah, they go back to Camp Blood. It's a little bit unfortunate that they don't really get into the camp. They get intercepted by the local law authority, the police. He gets quite a brutal death. He gets a hammer to the back of the skull, which is pretty brutal. Speaking of deaths, I know this is fairly well known, but there are two key death scenes in this film. The first being Mark, the character in the wheelchair, who gets a hatchet to the face, and then his wheelchair falls backwards down the steps in the heavy rain. It's a great scene. It's really, really memorable. When I was young, this is the death scene that stood out for me. I knew this film because of that death scene, because it's so out of nowhere. You really like this character as well. He's essentially about to get laid. He's a really likable character, which it goes for most of these people, actually. But anyway, his death scene, hatchet to the face, and the two characters I've just talked about, the Kevin Bacon and his girlfriend surrogates, Jeff and Sandra, they get double impalement by spear while I think they've just had sex in the bed. Both of these death scenes are directly taken from, literally directly taken from Mario Bava's 1971 giallo proto slasher film, A Bay of Blood, also known as Twitch of the Death Nerve. And I've heard that Steve Miner, he claims that he never saw the film, at least prior to making this. So, that's very hard to believe, because these two death scenes are absolutely ripped from that film. There's no denying it. It really is. The only way I would ever believe that Steve Miner did not see A Bay of Blood before this film is if possibly the writer of this film, who I'm not sure who that was, but maybe the writer saw it. He wrote those death scenes into the script, the shooting script, and then just by absolute sort of coincidence, Steve Miner filmed the scenes in question, shot for shot, exactly like Mario Bava did. It's possible. I mean, it's unlikely, but it's possible that's how it happened. So maybe Steve Miner isn't lying about that, but he probably is, to be honest. He probably is. I was talking about the likability of the characters there, and I really think they're really well done and fleshed out. There's not long scenes dedicated to each character or anything, really, but we get to know them quite well, and they are a fairly likable bunch. Even the Joker, who I mentioned earlier, who tows the car away, the truck, I forget his name as well, unfortunately, but you know who I mean, the ginger guy, the goofy looking guy. He's always playing sort of a early 80s handheld thing, LCD game. It's interesting that, again, he's not really irritating, to be honest, not to me anyway. He's actually quite a likeable character, even though he is the quintessential Joker character. And obviously they go off to the bar later on, and he doesn't come back to camp. He goes on to a late night bar, because you hear him ask a local if there are any late night bars around. And he doesn't die. I mean, that's really something, to be honest, in a slasher film from this period. The fact that the token Joker character doesn't die. I guess on that point, there is a black character as well in this film who I don't even think has any lines. He may have a couple, but he's not ever kind of center frame. And again, he doesn't die, which is refreshing to see. So, Scream can come along in 1996 and claim there's all these sort of hallmarks of the slasher genre, and that there's rules. If you break the rules, you die. It's really not as black and white as that. Generally speaking, they have a point. Wes Craven had a point, and but it just goes to show that slasher films are they're not as predictable as people would have you believe. There was more originality in them than people give them credit for. So you've also got to look at this one in context, I think, this first sequel, because when people think of the Friday the 13th series, they obviously think of the hulking Jason character. You think of the hockey mask, him virtually being unstoppable. In this one, he's not. He's just sort of he's a woodsman. He's someone who's just had no contact with the outside world. He fends for himself. He obviously kills and eats his own food. He lives in this rundown shack. he's more he's a lot more formidable in some ways because he's faster. He can think. He gets kicked in the balls at one point and he feels pain. He recoils from that, and this isn't something that the later, more established Jason character is portrayed, which is good. So again, it's hard to think of this one without being sort of influenced by what we think about the sequels. Obviously, this is the baghead Jason. He hasn't got the hockey mask yet, which is very iconic. It's a very good look. It just happens to have been overshadowed by the fact that the hockey mask came later and obviously dominated all of the sequels after part 3. The bag in question, again, obviously that was inspired by the town that dreaded sundown. I think he looks virtually the same as the look that they give their villain in that film. But it's no bad thing. It's a really good look and it works for the story of this one. Jason is deformed at the end of the day and he doesn't like the way he looks, presumably. So he covers himself with a bag. So then really he does look like a formidable serial killer. I think that's about all I've got to say, to be honest. It's a really good sequel. It's not my favourite Friday the 13th sequel. It's up there, but it's not my favourite. But I do like it for the reasons I've already stated. It captures the essence of the first film and it expands on the mythology a little bit more, which is good. It really helps that the heroine, the final girl, is a really likeable and believable character. She puts up a good fight, but she's still terrified. She still runs screaming from Jason. She's not overpowered, so to speak. She doesn't really. She's just believable, I think. I'll just sum it up as that. She's a very believable character. Amy Steele really, really owns this film. And it's a shame she didn't come back for part 3. I know she was in talks to come back. And obviously it would have been a different story. But, we got this one gem with her and it's great. It's a great portrayal for her for the first sequel. So yeah, by all means, please share your thoughts on the film itself in the comment section. If you disagree or have any points for me, please by all means leave comments as well. I'll be covering a variety of different genres going forward, and I'll be jumping around from different fields, different series of films. So yeah, thanks for your attention, and I'll be back shortly.